The process of photosynthesis demonstrates how both energy and nutrients are cycled through the biosphere. Just to review the overall process of photosynthesis, roots take up water through the soil. The water then travels up the stem of the plants to the leaves. Carbon dioxide enters the leaves from the atmosphere. Plants also need sun in order for photosynthesis to take place. In the picture on the right, we zoomed in into the surface, into the structures inside of the leaf. So leaves are made up of cells, and each cell is made up of cell parts called organelles that sort of act like organs do in our body because they each have a specific job and they work together so that the whole cell can function. One of the organelles found in plant cells is called a chloroplast. This is where photosynthesis takes place. During the process of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water, with the help of sunlight, are converted to oxygen, which is released from the leaves, and glucose, or sugar, which the plant uses. Photosynthesis takes place in two main steps. Each of these steps is made up of many complex chemical reactions, but we'll just focus on what happens to the products and reactants and the overall purpose of each step. The first step in photosynthesis is the light-dependent reactions. You might guess that these reactions can only happen during the day or in a bright room, and you'd be right. The purpose of this step is to capture energy from the sun and convert it into a form of energy that the cell can more easily use. There's two forms of energy the cell can use: high-energy electrons and the molecule ATP. ATP is the molecule living things use for energy. It sort of acts like a rechargeable battery. ATP is like the fully charged battery. When there's a process that requires energy in the cell, it uses ATP and drains the battery, so to speak. The battery can be recharged by breaking down sugar. We'll talk about that process later in the year. For now, it's important to know that ATP is a molecule the cell uses for energy. The other source of energy used in photosynthesis is high-energy electrons. We'll talk about where they come from in just a minute, but because the electrons have so much energy, they can't travel from one place to another alone. If they did, they could cause all kinds of chemical reactions that we don't want happening. So to prevent that from happening, the electrons are carried by a molecule called NADP+. Once it picks up an electron, it's called NADPH. You can think of the high-energy electrons like a hyperchild. If you send them off to do something, they might break things because they're bouncing off the walls. You know how accident-prone kids can be. So to keep them in check, someone has to hold their hand. NADP+ acts like the mother that holds the child's hand. The child is like the bouncy, energetic electron, and NADPH is the mother-child pair. So the first part of photosynthesis is the light-dependent reactions that harness energy from the sun. The second part of photosynthesis is called the Calvin cycle. This is where the sugar, or glucose, is actually made. The light-dependent reactions ultimately get energy from the sun, but the sunlight contains so much energy that if a plant tried to use sunlight directly to produce sugar, the leaves would overheat. So the first part of photosynthesis captures a small amount of energy from the sun to produce energetic compounds the plant can use. There are two of them, ATP and NADPH. The way it does this is using pigments. Remember that pigments are substances that absorb only certain colors of light. The purple blob in this picture is the pigment, maybe chlorophyll. That's the most common pigment in plants. Light excites the electrons that are part of the pigment so much that the electrons jump off the pigment and catch a ride on the molecule NADP+, making it NADPH. ATP is also made during the light reactions. In the process of all these chemical reactions, water molecules are broken in half to produce oxygen. So this is where the product of photosynthesis, oxygen, is created. It's then released from the plant, and we breathe it in. Next is the Calvin cycle. This is where sugar, or glucose, is produced. The energy from the light-dependent reactions is used here to connect carbon dioxide molecules together to produce sugar. Both ATP and high-energy electrons carried by NADPH are used to do this. So in the Calvin cycle, this is where carbon atoms get rearranged, turning carbon dioxide into glucose. So where in the cell does this all happen? If you zoom in on the leaf of a plant, you'll find that it's made of cells, just like all living things are. Each of these cells is made of smaller parts called organelles that each have their own job. Chloroplasts are the cell parts where photosynthesis takes place. If we zoom in further, we'll see inside of a chloroplast are stacks of sac-like membranes called thylakoid. A stack of thylakoids are called granum. So each of the individual green pancake-looking structures is a thylakoid, and a stack of pancakes is called a granum. Thylakoids look green because they contain the pigment chlorophyll. And they look green because chlorophyll absorbs all of the colors of the rainbow except for green. It reflects that. These pigments are the ones that provide electrons to NADPH when the sun excites them. It's on the surface of these thylakoid where light-dependent reactions take place. Surrounding the grana, that's the plural of granum, is fluid. This fluid-filled space is called the stroma. This is where the Calvin cycle takes place. So the glucose produced during the Calvin cycle dissolves into the stroma, making it a sugary, watery solution. Kind of sounds like syrup, doesn't it? The inside of a chloroplast can be compared to a stack of pancakes swimming in a sea of syrup. Copy this chart into your notes and use it to compare and contrast the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle.